Thank you so much, Marcy. We're glad to be here. Welcome, everyone. Jackie, you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Sure, I could go ahead and do that. Again, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here.
Okay,
Okay.
so this evening we're going to be sharing information about how you can support your adolescent students with reading. Our outcomes for today, we hope that you gain an understanding of specific learning disability in the area of reading. We also want to share some best practices that are used in the classroom to help your child improve his or her reading, and then also help you partner with your child's classroom teachers to support their reading skills at home. So before we get started, we want to give you an opportunity first to share in 1 or 2 words how you are feeling this evening. So if you'll just put that in the chat, we have a very
Yeah.
small group
Mhm.
today, only 13 participants. So we're able to take a minute to pause and just capture how you're feeling before we get started. Energized. All right.
Energized.
Thank you,
Uh-huh.
Dad. At 6 o'clock in the evening,
I
that's
know.
good. Wonderful.
Tired, but motivated and happy to be in attendance. Great.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Good.
All right.
Tired.
Tired and tired.
Okay.
Tired.
Tired to stressed.
Oh.
Oh. Ah.
All right. Well, I was a little tired before I started,
Excited.
but seeing you all gave me some energy. So, again, we're happy that you're here. Now, we want to segue into another question. Someone said cold at Home Depot.
Oh.
All right. So we want to segue into another question, if you're okay with sharing. What is your child's primary disability? We just want to gauge our participants just to make sure that we're sharing information that's most relative to you and your students' needs. And then after you share
Autism.
the disability, if you will also share whether or not your student has dyslexia.
Autism, dyslexia, autism. Okay, I see autism, dyslexia, ADHD.
Okay.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right. Okay.
All right. And I'm
All right.
assuming because you're here that your child struggles in some way with reading. So we're going to go ahead and start with our actual presentation.
Okay. Oops. Okay.
Okay. So this is a view of what's called the reading rope. Okay. And this was developed by Hollis Scarborough. He's a scientist at Haskins Laboratory and is a leading researcher of early language development and its connections to later literacy. The reading rope consists of lower and upper strands. The word recognition strands, which include phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition of familiar words, work together as the reader becomes accurate, fluent, and increasingly automatic with repetition and practice. Concurrently, the language comprehension strand, which is at the top, um, supports with background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. And together they reinforce one another, then weave together with the word recognition strands to produce a skilled reader. So in order to be a skilled reader, both parts have to connect. And a lot of times when we are working with students, especially those who have some form of a reading disability, one or more of the areas is not linked together. So we're going to show you in in a video how this all works. And it's a very short video.
Imagine you're going bungee jumping. This is your third time, so you feel really good about going up to the highest platform. You get to the top and step up to the jump line. Take one last look at your bungee cord. That's when you see the portions of your cord are frayed. How do you feel about jumping now that you know your rope isn't strong? We know from the simple view of reading that readers need to be skilled in both word recognition and language comprehension, and that poor skills in either one creates a breakdown in reading abilities. To provide effective instruction, it's helpful to understand with a little more detail exactly where the reader needs help. So let's dive deeper into this equation and explore Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. The lower strand of the reading rope focuses on word recognition and includes 3 critical skills: phonological awareness, decoding, and sight recognition. These skills affect how we interact with printed text. Phonological awareness is our ability to work with speech sounds of language, like knowing that syllables make up words, handle, or recognizing the individual sounds within words, f. Decoding requires knowledge of the alphabetic principle, which is that sounds are represented by letters, and that not all spelling-sound correspondences are direct one-to-one relationships. Like, you can spell the k sound several different ways. For example, the word cake has 2 spellings for this one sound. Sight recognition means that you see a familiar word and can instantly process it. Be aware that this doesn't mean only high-frequency words. To understand a reader struggling with the word recognition strand of the reading rope, try reading this out loud. That's pretty hard, right? We've artificially frayed your reading rope by removing the vowels, simulating a word recognition weakness. You might be able to get a few words here and there, but you can't decode accurately or efficiently. As these lower strand skills...
Okay. And hopefully from that brief presentation, you can see then that reading is comprised of a number of different skills. And what the research shows us is that when there's an impairment or a difficulty in any one of those strands, the entire reading process then can break down for these students. So now I'm going to share a little bit about the neuroscience of reading. Now, what research has shown us and how this research came about is that a number of researchers have taken a look at what the brains of healthy individuals look like when they're reading. And how they've done this is using what we call functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what that does essentially is that as we're doing a task such as reading, the areas of the brain that are needed for those specific tasks are activated as energy is used up. And then there's this intense blood flow to the areas, bringing additional oxygen into that area. That increased blood and oxygen then increases what we call the magnetic properties of the blood. And so the blood with higher concentrations then will produce stronger signals on the scans. So I don't know if any of you have ever been actually in an MRI machine, but it's very similar to being in that machine. So when the healthy brains of these individuals have been observed while reading, research has shown that there are 2 major pathways to reading in the brain. And if you take a look at the visual image of the brain, just very quickly, the brain is divided into 2 hemispheres down the middle, left and right hemisphere. In each hemisphere, there are then 4 lobes. There is the frontal lobe. If you think of the front part of your forehead, that's the frontal lobe. Then there's the temporal lobe, the green area, and that sits right above your ear. Then there's the parietal lobe that is approximately more in the top back part of the brain. And then the occipital lobe, that is in the rear part of the brain. Now, while a number of different areas of the brain all work together, we do know that for the most part, the frontal lobe is engaged in what we call those executive, those higher problem-solving skills. The parietal lobe is associated more with sensory feelings and motor. The temporal lobe is where language, for the most part, is housed, as well as the major part of our memory, which is that hippocampus. The occipital is related to vision. So what this brain studies have shown is that there are 2 major areas. There's one upper and there's one lower in the back part of the brain. The upper area occurs at the junction of what we call the parietal and the temporal lobes. So that's at the junction of the yellow and the green area. And this upper pathway, which is located just before the ear, this is more critical when we're now beginning to learn to read or when we're first decoding an unfamiliar word, because we're pulling the word apart and putting it back together. The occipital temporal lobe, which is lower pathway and is more in the back area of the brain, that is described as what we call the more express way to reading, because it allows a skilled reader to more automatically recognize a word. So you want to think of the upper pathway as you see an unfamiliar word, you break it down in a very slow pace, you put it back together, you break it down, you put the word back together. And then once you've seen that word and it's become automatic, now we're using this lower pathway, which is the occipital temporal region. So in a very general and basic way, this is how we know that reading occurs in the brain. Now remember, these are just the primary reading centers, but there are other areas that are also involved in reading in the brain. Now I'm going to turn it over to Takisha to just give us a few characteristics of what students look like when they struggle with reading.
Okay, so as you may or may not know, dyslexia manifests itself with these characteristics in the classroom. So we want to take a minute to just take a look at these. We have a column for preschool skills, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and then third grade. Because as we know, a lot of times as parents, there are things that we see that we have questions about early on that may eventually manifest itself into what we now know is dyslexia. What were some of the red flags you saw in your children in their formative years? So let's pause and have just a few seconds to respond to that. And you can respond in the chat. What were some of the red flags that you saw in your children in their formative years regarding reading? And when we look at the preschool column, we have things such as difficulty segmenting syllables in songs, difficulty keeping rhythm or even rhyming words. Kindergarten, difficulty with awareness of words as a unit, difficulty matching words with the initial sounds, attentional difficulties, little or no eye contact, short attention span. First grade, some things such as lack of understanding of a book, they entered first grade not knowing their letter names and sounds. Second grade, reversing beginning letters, reversing whole words, reversing blends. And then when we get to third grade, things such as still having poor decoding skills, inability to recognize initial and final sounds and words, and overuse of context skills, just to name a few. So I can see Ms. Tally, thank you. You said overuse of context clues and guessing.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else want to share? Poor sentence structure, short attention span, substituting similar letters. Great information. Okay, so these were all some of those skills that they were lacking in the early stages, which have now manifested into our reading disability.
Okay, good.
So now I'm going to turn it back over to Jackie, and she's going to explain a little bit more about specific learning disabilities.
Okay. Now we know there are a number of different reasons why children may struggle to read. We're going to take a look specifically at two of those reasons. We're going to look at specific learning disability, and then we're going to take a look at dyslexia as a subcategory of specific learning disability. To frame our discussion, we're going to talk about specific learning disability within the context of the school setting. Now, we do know that outside of school, there's a medical diagnosis of specific learning disorder, which is not exactly synonymous with specific learning disability. So we're going to talk about specific learning disability under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the federal law that relates to special education, and it serves two primary purposes. One, to ensure that all children with disabilities have access to a free and appropriate public education, but it also ensures that the rights of children with disabilities and that their parents are also protected. So as we look at this particular law under IDEA, We know that there's several disabilities that our students can be classified, one of which is the specific learning disabilities, which I've highlighted in blue. But if you take a look, I know some of you indicated that your children were diagnosed with autism, and we also saw ADHD, which would come under the category of other health impairments, in addition to any other medical disorder. Now let's take a look at how the disabilities are actually distributed. In the most recent statistics from the National Center of Education and Statistics, we see that specific learning disability continues to be the largest category, which is about 33%, which means that about 7.1 million of our school-aged children are currently identified as having a specific learning disability. So let's take a closer look so that we understand exactly what do we mean by when we say a specific learning disability. Now, the federal regulations, which we refer to as IDEA in the shorter form for the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, defines specific learning disability, and you can take a few seconds just to read the definition, which is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, whether it's spoken or written, and then those difficulties manifest themselves in the imperfect ability to listen, to think, to speak, read, write, spell, or to do mathematical calculations. So you can see that there is a several impact as a result of the deficits in those basic psychological processes. Then when we talk about specific learning disabilities, we're also including some other disabilities. So this also includes perceptual disabilities, brain injury. The term minimal brain dysfunction is no longer used, but you can see that dyslexia is also a part of the category of specific learning disability, as well as developmental aphasia, which is a language disorder. And for some of you, if you've either heard of dysgraphia or dyscalculia, they're also included under the umbrella of specific learning disability. Now, I want us to take a close look at what we call those basic psychological processes. Because if you notice in the federal law, there's no exact description of what we refer to when we talk about those basic psychological processes. But here's what the empirical literature or research has actually shown us. When we look at basic reading skills, there are a number of processes that are involved in reading. And for those of you who have very young children, if you remember when they first start to read, and then as reading evolved, you may see actually some of these processes reflected in how they learn to read. So one of the basic or most important processes that are involved in reading is what we call auditory processing, which also involves that phonological awareness and phonetic coding. So at the basic level, we're talking about that letter sound association, which is that alphabetic principle. We're talking about children being able to discriminate between sounds, bit, but, bat, and being able to hear the difference in those sounds. We're talking about rhyming, which is especially very important for young students, wall, fall, tall. We're talking about the ability to blend words, and we're talking about blending from small to longer words. So a word such as cat has 3 phonemes. So we're talking about the ability to hear those distinct phonemes and to blend them into a word. And then at a higher level, we're talking about the child's ability to manipulate those phonemes. So if I say to a child, the word is cat, now say cat without k, they should be able to remove that C and to know that the remaining word is at. Or they should be able to change the beginning k sound to p sound and know that the new word is pat. Another important process is very important in reading, the basic part of reading and decoding, is what we call long-term memory. And this is where we look at your ability to simply encode, store, and then retrieve any previously learned information. And so for young kids, when we look at reading at the basic level, we're talking about their ability to remember the association between their letter and their sounds, that associative memory. So when I see the letter P, I know it makes the P sound. So that associative memory becomes very critical for early reading. And then another skill or process that is very important is what we call rapid automatic naming. And that looks at the child's ability to rapidly produce names when we provide them with that visual stimulus. So it can be rapidly calling the names of colors when presented with color tabs. It can be rapidly naming numbers, rapidly naming objects, or in the case of reading, rapidly naming letters. So if presented with the row of letters or STV, the child who does well in rapid automatic naming would go RSTV. For the child who struggles, they may say R, S, C, no, T. So the child who struggles with rapid automatic naming would have a hard time reproducing or labeling the letters. And we do know that rapid automatic naming is very important in the early years. Another process that is very important for reading is what we call phonological memory or short-term memory. And this is simply your ability to hold information, those sounds and words, in temporary storage. And this is very critical because as the child is reading or putting together those phonemic strings, they have to remember each sound in its sequence in order to remember the word. So for example, if the child hears the sounds k, a, t, the child has to remember each sound in its appropriate location and position so that they know that the word is cat. The child who struggles with that auditory memory is going to have a hard time remembering the sequence of the sounds. So phonological memory is very important when we're recalling and being able to correctly pronounce an unfamiliar word, especially those multi-syllabic words. And then another cognitive process that is very important for reading is called orthographic processing. What this looks at is the child's ability to remember or to have a visual memory of the spatial arrangements of letters in words. So what we call rapid or automatic word recognition. So for example, seeing the word were, W-E-R-E, I'm able to remember visually that the letter W was followed in place by the E, then the R, and then the E, and not W-R-E-E. So it's that visual memory. And this is very critical, as I said, for automatic word recognition, especially for words that are not decodable, those phonetically irregular words. And then another process that is very important for basic decoding skills is verbal working memory. So this is where the child is holding information in memory, but they have to actually do something with that information. They have to manipulate it. And the best predictor of ability to identify letters for young students is actually that verbal working memory. And we do know that short-term memory and working memory, they actually go hand in hand. They work together, especially when the child is trying to decode multi-syllabic words. So those processes are very important in terms of working together. Now, when we look at the area of fluency, again, you see that similar cognitive processes are involved in fluency. There's auditory processing again, there's that long-term memory and retrieval, phonological memory, and orthographic processing. Again, similar to basic decoding, those are the skills that are important in fluency. So you can see that if any of those skills are impaired, decoding is impacted, but fluency is going to also be impacted. Another cognitive process that is also important in fluency is what we call processing speed. And when we talk about processing speed, we're talking about the time that it takes a child to complete a simple rote task, especially when they're required to maintain their attention and concentration. So simple tasks may be asking a student to make quick visual discriminations of matching letters or matching words or even matching objects. And processing speed is actually critical across all the ages in terms of reading, but especially so in the younger years. What we do know is that rapid processing of the letters and words is very necessary for fluent reading. So processing speed and rapid automatic naming actually distinguish between those students who are fluent readers versus those who struggle with the rate at which they're able to read. And then we look at reading comprehension. If we look at the processes that are involved in reading comprehension, again, we see that there are a number of cognitive processes. The first one is when we talk about the child's language and crystallized knowledge, which is that fund of information or background knowledge that is either gained from classroom experiences or their home life and cultural experiences. And in terms of the background knowledge, we're looking at their language development, the ability to understand syntax and to put words together in a sentence that is meaningful. We look at their word knowledge or the knowledge of meanings of words. We look at verbal reasoning, but the listening ability is also very key in terms of comprehension. And we know that these skills become even more important as kids matriculate to the higher grade levels. Fluid reasoning is another cognitive skill that is very important to reading comprehension. When we're talking about fluid reasoning, we're talking about that ability to problem solve with a novel type of problem that can't be performed automatically because you have not been explicitly taught the specific problem. So here are some examples. Forming or recognizing concepts. So question, how are a dog, cat, and cow alike? That's a fluid reasoning type of question. You want the child to be able to say they're both animals at a higher level. A lower response would be probably saying they all have legs or they walk, but the higher category would be animals. Identifying and perceiving relationships, what we call analogies. So for example, if I said to the child, sun is to morning, as moon is to night, being able to understand the relationships between those words. And drawing inferences, having read a story, being able to answer those why, who, what, where types of questions, drawing those inferences. So that's all related to fluid reasoning. And then we have morphological awareness, which looks at the ability to for the child to identify patterns and to draw meaning from word parts like the prefixes and the suffixes and the roots. So for example, the child learns that the prefix re means again or back. So when seeing the word rewrite, reread, return, the child is better able to read those words. Processing speed is also very important for comprehension. The child who's reading or decoding very slow and effortlessly is going to impact fluency, which is then going to impact comprehension. And we do know that when a child spends a lot of their time and effort on decoding, they're allocating all of the attention and working memory resources to that lower level skill. And so those resources are not available then for the higher level skill of comprehension. There are a couple of the skills that are also important in comprehension when we talk about those basic psychological processes. There's that working memory, and working memory becomes even more important as text becomes increasingly longer. So working memory is needed to analyze, to reconfigure, and to encode information that we have to store in long-term memory. So when we talk about working memory, it's very important as the child is reading, they have to be able to make connections to what they've read at the beginning of the text, to the end of the text, but they also have to make connections to their prior knowledge, and then they have to organize a sequence in the story. All of those skills require working memory. And then attention, a very important skill because it underlies all of the other skills. Auditory processing is impacted if attention is impaired. When we talk about attention, we talk about focused attention, the child's ability to just direct their attention to the text that is in front of them. We talk about divided attention, being able to focus on the internal background knowledge, the text that is in front of them, the first paragraph, the third paragraph, and then sustained attention, which is extremely critical for reading comprehension. So for those of you who indicated that your children were diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, oftentimes you see that those students struggle with comprehension because of that sustained attention, especially as text becomes longer. And then a final cognitive process that's involved in reading is what we call those executive functioning skills. And when we talk about executive functioning skills, we're talking about this large group of cognitive processes that are important for directing major cognitive tasks like perception, emotion, thought, and action. But they also direct or cue other cognitive tasks like our reasoning or language or visual, spatial, or memory capacities. So executive functioning is critical for reading comprehension, especially as our children get older. And we do know that for students who are diagnosed with autism, those who are diagnosed with ADHD, that they have a variety of deficits in this area. So when we talk about executive functioning, we're talking of planning, which is important for being able to read with a purpose in mind or that directive reading. We're talking about organization, being able to sequence the events. We're talking about self-monitoring, being able to stay engaged, but as you're reading, also to monitor your understanding of the text and to reread or to stop and ask questions when you recognize that you're not understanding. We're talking about cognitive flexibility or set maintenance, which looks at a child's ability to, as they're reading, to shift back and forth between the text, my background knowledge, my prior knowledge, the beginning of the text, the middle of the text, and to make those ongoing shifts in order to maintain comprehension. And then inhibition as an executive functioning skill is also very important in comprehension because it allows the child to avoid distractions and also to monitor whether or not they're reading too quickly such that comprehension may be impaired. So when we're talking about specific learning disability, under IDA, there are explicit inclusionary criteria. We talk about who then meets eligibility criteria for specific learning disability. So when we look at the law, here are three major questions that we're looking at. Does the child fail to achieve adequately for the age, or when we look at state-approved grade level standards? And it could be in one or more of the following areas. So it's oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension, maybe the targeted areas for those who only have specific learning disability in reading, but then we also have math calculation and math problem solving. We are also looking at the child who fails to meet sufficient progress and achievement, which is adequate for the age or grade level after they've been provided with a series of scientific research-based interventions. Or when we look at that assessment data, we see that that student demonstrates a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in either their academic performance, their achievement, both, or even in their intellectual development. So when we're talking about a student with specific learning disability, we're talking about a student who demonstrates this type of profile. There are two major, what we call exclusionary criteria, which I must mention. And so when we're speaking of specific learning disability, we're not talking about those learning challenges that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, motor, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, cultural factors, environmental or economic disadvantage, or limited English proficiency. While a student with specific learning disability some of these factors may apply to the student, they're not primarily reason why the child is struggling to read. So for example, we could have a student who does has experiences economic disadvantage, or maybe there's some environmental factors such as attendance, but those factors are not the primary reason why the child is struggling. And then we also have to ensure that learning difficulties are not due to a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or in math. So those are some of the major factors that we have to consider when we talk about the child with a specific learning disability. So here are some important points on specific learning disability. We know that this group is very diverse. And if you looked at the different cognitive processes that we quickly reviewed, any one of those areas or combination of those areas can be a deficit for any one particular student. And specific learning disability then can occur in multiple learning domains. We have some students for whom it's only in reading, for some whom it's only in math or written language, or it can be any combination of any of those academic areas. We know that each student with specific learning disability is very different in terms of their processing deficits, or even the severity of those deficits. They can range from mild to more severe. And then we know that these students also vary in terms of their relative strengths or their areas of strengths. What we do know is that research tells us that 80% of students with specific learning disability are actually identified as having difficulties in reading. So that reading is very critical. Now, what we always also have found is that specific learning disability occurs with other disorders. So I did notice that one of our parents mentioned that their child has ADHD as well as specific learning disability. So ADHD definitely occurs to a high rate with kids who are identified with specific learning disability, but we also see that anxiety and depression are also identified in students with specific learning disability. And that could be for a number of reasons. Some of the reasons being that students with specific learning disability, out of frustration and their struggles with reading, we can see that that anxiety and depression may develop secondary to their academic difficulties. So I'm going to switch to talk a little bit more about dyslexia as a subcategory of specific learning disability. So here's a definition of dyslexia by the International Dyslexia Association. So take a few seconds to just look at the definition, which I'm going to read again. So dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. Now, these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. And here is where dyslexia is different from the broad category of specific learning disabilities. Remember, we said in specific learning disabilities, there can be a deficit on one or more of the basic psychological processes. But with dyslexia, the deficit is very specific to the process of phonological component of language. And is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. As a result of that, the secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience, and together they then impact the growth of the vocabulary and their background knowledge. So here is a visual presentation of the model of dyslexia. So at the very top, we have the deficits in phonological component of language, which then, as you can see, impacts those four key areas of reading: decoding, spelling, accuracy, and fluency. Together, these difficulties then impact comprehension, and then there's an impact on the breadth of their reading experience. Because reading experience is limited, then vocabulary and background knowledge are impacted. And then we have a cycle. Because vocabulary and background knowledge are impacted, then we have the deficit or the impact on comprehension. So this is the visual model of what dyslexia looks like. I'm going to share a little bit of the work of Sally Shewitz, who's done a lot of research on dyslexia. And she's actually at the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. And in her work, she's taken a look at a number of studies around the world that have looked at dyslexia. And what the data has shown is that individuals with dyslexia, that they're actually using different pathways in the brain than those used by good readers. So let's see what those differences are. If you remember earlier, I showed you the slide where I said that reading, the major or the primary reading areas, are occurring in this area, which is the parietal temporal area, which is where we're pulling those words apart at the junction of the temporal and the parietal lobe, and that the other major area occurs at the junction of the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. So skilled readers are actually activating these areas in the back of the brain, as well as this area, what we call Broca's area, in the front of the brain when they're reading. But in her work, Shewitz describes what she called the neural signature of dyslexia, where the research shows that individuals with dyslexia are actually not activating these typical neural pathways in the back of the brain, which is seen in skilled readers. Actually, what they showed was an underactivation of these areas in the posterior part of the brain, the back of the brain, especially in the occipital temporal area. And remember, we said that this area is the area that is responsible for automatic word recognition. And what the research shows is that unlike skilled readers who are activating these areas in the back of the brain on the left side of the brain. Individuals with dyslexia, what the imaging studies have shown is that they're actually relying on alternate routes in the brain when they're reading. And where they're relying is in this frontal area, but they're also using frontal as well as posterior regions in the right area of the brain. Whereas individuals who are skilled readers, we're more utilizing the left hemisphere of the brain and the areas more in the posterior region. So this confirms, studies then have confirmed that the reason why dyslexic individuals struggle with reading is because there's underactivation in the areas that are really responsible for that phonological processing, that breaking apart words and putting them back together, and then this automatic word recognition. And what we do know about the occipital temporal area is that it's integrating phonology, the sounds, orthography, what words look like with their meaning. And the more and more that students are reading and identifying words and their meaning, the more and more they're doing that, this occipital temporal area in the back of the brain is being built up more and more. That's why it's very important, even as we're teaching our young students to read, that we're also focusing on word meanings while we're teaching them to decode. So the research identifies 4 types of dyslexia. There's a dysphonetic dyslexia, where there's difficulty sounding out words in the phonological manner. So what we see is that these students tend to rely on what words look like. And so they would often guess at words using that initial letter. Then there's the surface dyslexia. These students have difficulty with rapid and automatic recognition of words in print. What they often try to do is to break every word down into their distinct or their smallest phoneme sound instead of putting the sounds together. And then mixed dyslexia, reading deficits, this is characterized by not only phonological deficits, but the orthographic processing deficits. And the research indicates that this is the more severe form of dyslexia. And then we have the comprehension deficits, where students are able to decode, but they struggle to actually derive meaning from print. Now, here are a couple of questions that I want you to just very quickly, we can post in the chat very quickly, and you could just answer myth or fact. Let's start with the first one. Dyslexia affects only a small percent of individuals with learning disabilities. And if you could just very quickly post in the chat, do you think this is a myth or a fact? Okay, I see a couple of myths. And that's right. It actually is a myth. 15 to 20% of the population has a language-based disability, with actually 70 to 80% of those identified as having a specific learning disability in the area of reading. What about the second one? Dyslexia runs in families, myth or fact? Okay, yes, that is a fact. When we look at twin studies, we do know that genes play a major part in dyslexia. And we do know that children with a parent with dyslexia, they actually have a 40 to 60% chance of also having dyslexia. Let's look at the third one. Dyslexia occurs more frequently in boys than in girls. Is that a myth or a fact? Okay, I saw a fact, myth, a myth, fact. Okay, all right. And actually, the research is kind of mixed on this one, but actually, when we look at Shawitt's work, she indicated that actually boys and girls are actually just as likely to be diagnosed with dyslexia. However, when we look at those who are diagnosed in the school setting, boys have a higher rate of being diagnosed with dyslexia And Sherwitz, in her work, believes that it's because boys are more likely to first be identified for behavioral challenges, which then lead to them being identified with the reading disability. But when we look at research that is done outside of the school setting, boys and girls are just as likely to be identified as having dyslexia. Dyslexia is defined by reversals, reading backward, and mirror writing. Is that a fact or a myth? Okay, I see some myths. Yes, that is a myth. We do know that children, young children, even those who are not at risk for dyslexia, that letter reversals, mirror writing can be seen in children who are not later diagnosed with dyslexia. Dyslexia affects everyone the same way. Is that a myth or fact? Okay. Okay. All right. Is that a myth or fact? Let's see. Okay, I saw a couple of myths. That is, okay, good. That is a myth. We know that dyslexia occurs on a spectrum from mild to more severe, and it looks very different. There are very different dyslexic profiles across individuals. And then dyslexia is a lifetime disorder. Is that a myth or a fact? Okay, yes, that is a fact, that even though we know many individuals do make significant progress and go on to lead very successful lives, we do know that even those individuals who do learn to decode, they do so at a very slow rate. And so there is some impact still seen across the lifespan. Great. Now let's take a quick look at some of the early signs of dyslexia. So in those early years in pre-K and kindergarten, we see those difficulty with nursery rhymes, remembering the names of letters. Remember, we talked about those auditory working memory deficits, difficulties recognizing letters and names, pronouncing or mispronouncing familiar words, difficulties with rhyming. Those are some of the signs that we see in those early years. And then when we move on to kindergarten and first grade, what we see are some of those errors showing no connection to the sounds of the letters on the page. So saying puppy instead of the written word dog. Difficulties understanding that words come apart. So if you say to the child, say cupcake, now say cupcake without cake, they have a hard time saying that remaining part of the word cup. They often complain about how hard reading is. There's a history of reading problems, difficulty sounding out even the simplest of words, and difficulty associating letters with sounds, B with the B sound. And then as they matriculate to the higher grade levels, some of the other signs that we see is that ongoing slow difficulty in acquiring reading skills. There's difficulty reading unfamiliar words, so they're often guessing. They appear to struggle with a strategy for reading new words. They avoid reading out loud. Lots of difficulties with words, especially words for which there's no visual images. So for example, words such as the and that. There's labored reading. Oftentimes parents and teachers will report that as they're reading, they're making lots of substitutions, they're omitting words, or they're mispronouncing words. And there's a tendency, I know I saw someone indicated there's a tendency to rely on context for meaning. And what we see that among older students, there are difficulties learning that foreign language. Now, among students with dyslexia, not only is reading impacted, but we know that speaking is impacted. One of the major difficulties we see is what we call word retrieval. So they often seem to be searching for the correct word when they're speaking. So then they will use vague language, what we call a lot of fillers or stuff or thing for words. There's lots of hesitation, lots of when they're speaking. They often confuse words that sound alike, tornado for volcano, or substituting, for example, lotion for ocean. Their pronunciation of long, of unfamiliar and complicated words. And as I said before, lots of difficulty with that rapid retrieval of information. Other areas often impacted as well, trouble, difficulty remembering dates, names, telephone numbers, anything that is rote information, struggling to finish tests on time, difficulty again, as we said, learning that foreign language, spelling and difficulties with handwriting is also seen, and difficulty memorizing multiplication facts. That's also another major deficit that we see that we may see in students with dyslexia. So while we talk about all the deficits that may present, we also want to make sure that we highlight that these individuals and students also bear with them a number of strengths. We can see, I'm sure, for those of you who are parents, I'm sure as you reflect, you may see some of these strengths which are highlighted here. You may also see them in your children. So we see some of the strengths, that curiosity, that great imagination, their eagerness to embrace new ideas, a larger vocabulary than may be seen for their age, enjoyment of things like puzzles and putting together models. Even though they may struggle to decode and comprehension may be difficult when they're reading, when stories are read to them, they're able to understand. And then some other areas of strengths we see are those stronger abstract reasoning skills, the ability to get that big picture, and the ability to read and understand at a high level overlearned or highly practiced words. So sometimes we would have parents who say, but he is reading. Well, oftentimes the student has memorized those words, so they appear to be reading, but they're actually reading from memory and not decoding the words. So those are some of the strengths that we see among individuals with dyslexia. And then other things is that sophisticated listening, vocabulary, and then the ability to excel in areas that are not dependent on reading, such as our math and computers, or other areas like the social studies and creative writing. So that is the end of my part on the presentation on highlighting specific learning disability and dyslexia. If there are any questions, or if we're going to wait until the end to take questions, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, who's going to now speak more specifically about interventions that you can use to address these reading difficulties.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. So we are just going to give you some things to think about, since we want to make sure that we have some time to answer any of your questions that you may have. So as I go through my part, I want you to think about some ways that you are currently helping some of your students at home. So you may have some aha moments. And then we also want you to think about, what is your greatest struggle in supporting your students' reading needs at home? And then 2, are there any external supports that you're currently using that you found beneficial in supporting your students? Okay. Next slide, Dr. Gordon. So we'll take a moment to take a look at this slide. Now, sometimes there's confusion about how students are supported by grade level. So we know that in the early years, there's a focus on phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. However, when we start talking about students who are older in grades 4 through 12, there is a shift in how the reading instruction is provided. So there needs to be more of a focus on word study, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and something called motivation, because we know as our students get older, and sometimes the reading gap unfortunately widens for some of our students, they tend to lack motivation to even do or to even read. So when you ask them to pick up a book, it's like asking them to clean up their room. They want to avoid it like the plague. So we are going to talk about more so today, focusing on our students who are in the adolescent ages, okay? The adolescent age range. So when we think about word study, research from the National Reading Panel has stated that adolescents should not be given the same kinds of instruction that we would normally give to our much younger students. Adolescents who struggle with reading may need more support with decoding multisyllabic words or unusual words, words with more complex endings. Also recognizing common words by sight, reading and writing words that have irregular spelling patterns, and identifying families of words that share common roots, prefixes, or suffixes. This particular slide shows a really helpful poster to help your students identify, and even for some of our parents, to identify the different syllable types. So there are 6 syllable types. Our first step in word study is to show your child how to break multisyllabic words into recognizable parts. And so when we look at the 6 syllable types, we have things such as closed syllables, okay? And there's some examples there for you, words like democratic or beverage. Open syllables are words that end the first syllable with a vowel, okay? Examples are program, table, recent. Then we have vowel consonant E, okay? Some of our words that have silent E patterns. Vowel teams, some of our more complex vowel variations, as I like to call them. So AW, awful, AI in the word trainer, and so on. R controlled vowels, some of you may know them as bossy R vowels or bossy R words. We have some examples here. Consonant plus LE words, words that end with LE, such as dribble, little, okay? And then we have something called the schwa, which is where the vowel is not as pronounced. It sounds like okay? So damage, active, nation, okay? So when you're going through some of these multisyllabic words, make sure that you encourage your students to slow down when reading the words and model your own reading strategies or word attack skills for your students to help them blend them together, okay? The second step is to encourage your child to practice reading and writing commonly used words that defy regular spelling patterns. When they're reading in text, have them highlight such words. Encourage them to use the words in their own writing. And then also having them keep track of the words that they've mastered. I know when I was growing up, there was a chart, a sticker chart that our teachers would keep in the classroom to really track attendance. However, those charts are really great for helping your students recognize the words that they've mastered. And that's something that you can easily get from the dollar store. But it's really important, especially for our older students, for them to really buy into tracking their progress, because once they start to see the progress that they're making, it's like igniting a fire under them. You tend to see increased motivation for reading. Okay, another step is to practice common root words, prefixes, and suffixes. Oftentimes we think of our adolescent students as learning, this information in elementary school. However, a lot of us take that for granted. Not all students mastered those skills in elementary school. So we still have to explicitly teach them some of the prefixes, such as pre, pro, auto, suffixes such as ology, us, and ism, and then roots such as ped, as in the word pedal, or pedestrian, okay? Having them identify and break those words apart and recognize those common roots, prefixes, and suffixes to help them build their word attack skills. Here are some tips to help you as you're supporting your students. Their word study practice should be regular and frequent. It has to be practiced daily, 10 to 15 minutes of practice a day, and then only focusing on 5 to 10 words at a time. We want them to make sure that they're mastering words, and it takes several exposures, especially for our students with dyslexia and other reading disabilities, to be able to master these words. Also making sure that we keep things relevant for them. Again, the motivation is key. We should treat these words as a larger effort to engage our adolescent children in discussing interesting books and other materials in writing as well, making sure that they incorporate it in their writing. And then bottom line, make it fun, okay? Make it fun for them. Try to incorporate these words in a playful way. Fluency is something that some people take for granted. When we talk about deficits that students may have in reading, a lot of times fluency kind of goes by the wayside. But fluency is actually one of the key parts in helping students become proficient readers and to address the comprehension needs, okay? Because if they have slow and labored fluency skills, it's going to be harder for them to comprehend information. Okay, and Harrison Hodges defined fluency as the freedom from word identification problems that might impede comprehension in silent reading or in the expression of their ideas. Fluency includes accuracy, okay, making sure that they read the words correctly, rate, not necessarily telling them to read as fast as they can, or also not telling them to read too slow. Expression, they have to read with feeling so they don't sound like a robot. And then also adhering to different types of punctuations, including commas and periods. Okay. As defined by the Department of Education, they did a study of fourth graders back in 2002. And this particular information is it's startling. The researchers found that while 80% of students could read quickly enough to follow the text, and while 75% read most words accurately, only 61% of those students were able to read more or less with appropriate expression and tone. So automaticity, intonation, and expression are essential factors in our students gaining meaning from text. Here are some strategies to help support your students with increasing their fluency. Make sure that you read aloud to them. Although they may be 12, 13, some may be in high school, it's important that they continue to hear fluent reading models, okay? So modeling fluent reading for them is important. Also explicitly stating or showing them how they can adapt their voices to the different types of text that they're reading. So we know when we're talking about more content specific text, we tend to read that with a steady tone, okay? However, if we're reading a story, a narrative, sometimes we try to bring those characters alive by changing our voices when we're reading for different characters, okay? Next slide. Also choosing excerpts of short text that your student has read before and that they understand so they can truly focus on building their fluency skills, okay? Rather than really trying to battle through, trying to decode unfamiliar words as well as comprehending text that they haven't seen before. So giving them familiar text to practice their fluency skills is a good way to build their fluency. Also, and this is something that I've done with my own children, timing them when they read, having them become more aware of how long it's taking for them to read. And you can also choose a short passage of text to practice this. Some students like to do it on their iPad if they use the voice reader feature on the iPad. They can time themselves as they're reading. And over time, if they're using the same text over and over again, they can start to see their time decreasing as they become more and more fluent. Also, using poetry, fluency phrases, and even reading theater are good ways, readers theater are great ways to practice fluency. One last tip, to have your students track their own progress because they will become excited about their growth over time. Another area of reading that's really important is vocabulary development. When we take a look at this particular statistic, which is at the first bullet, studies have shown that children who have educated parents and come from affluent areas typically enter school with a vocabulary of 5,000 or more words. However, students from low-income backgrounds often enter school only knowing 2,500 words. But by the time they get to college, they need to have 75,000 to 120,000 words in their vocabulary bank. So we have a lot of work to do. So some strategies to support with building vocabulary, again, as I mentioned with the word study, taking 5 to 10 words each week. And researchers have found that it takes 10 to 15 exposures for words to stick. So students have to be exposed to these words over and over and over again for them to stick in their memory bank. Also, modeling what to do when you come across an unknown word, okay? So teaching them some of those strategies that you may have learned to help you build your own vocabulary when you were growing up and even now. Also, reviewing content-specific words from the different content areas such as math, science, and social studies. Pointing out real-life examples for those terms is very helpful. And then also helping your child to make visual connections to vocabulary words also helps them remember those terms. And we'll talk about visualizing in just a second. For comprehension, we all know that comprehension is the ability to gain meaning from text. However, it involves metacognitive processes such as matching thinking and problem-solving strategies to specific learning situations, identifying key points in messages, clarifying purposes for reading, also monitoring one's own comprehension through self-questioning, and then taking corrective action if comprehension fails. The bottom line, we have to understand what we're reading. Here are some comprehension strategies that are helpful to help students build their comprehension skills. Rereading the text. Something that teachers do often is activating prior knowledge. So they're trying to tap into, what does the student already know? How does what I'm reading relate to some of the things that I've already learned? Also using context clues when they're reading. I know that some of our parents mentioned that their students have autism, and a lot of times making inferences, reading between the lines can be a struggle for their students. However, explicitly talking to your students about what does this mean, stopping at some of those phrases that require the students to read in between the lines and have a dialogue about them. Also thinking out loud, thinking how you would attack certain questions. Summarizing the story, thinking about the different parts of the story. And we have some graphic organizers that we'll share with you that can support with summarization. Making predictions. And the one that I want to really highlight is visualizing. A lot of times our students with reading disabilities have difficulty holding on to information. One of the ways that can be very helpful for students is to teach them how to visualize. How do we make this story come alive, okay? And there are some resources that I've linked in the presentation to show you different structure words that can help your students build their visualization skills. Next slide. Here are some additional strategies to support comprehension. Ask your child probing questions about the book and connect the events to his or her own life. Asking wondering questions. I wonder why the girl did that. How do you think he felt and why? Okay. What lesson did you learn from the story? Help your child make connections between what he or she has read, and then tying that into similar experiences, okay? So tapping into that background knowledge again. Helping your child monitor their understanding and teaching them to continually ask whether they understand what they've read. Since we're talking about older students, especially in middle and high school, annotation is something that teachers are teaching your students. So having them chunk the text or supporting them with chunking the text, maybe reading a paragraph at a time and writing their reflections on a sticky note is a great way for them to jog their memory. Also, recall key points in the story that they want to remember. Also, having your student differentiate between narrative and expository text, because we know that there are different text structures and there's different ways of going about attacking those types of texts when they're exposed to them. The last part is all about motivation. So as I shared in the beginning, it's really important for our older students to be motivated and to buy into this thing called reading. So when teaching older students, the challenge isn't to provide systemic instruction, but also to help them build trust in their teachers, confidence in their own abilities, and enthusiasm for the work that they're doing in school. Next slide. So some ways to increase motivation are to help your child select reading materials of interest. Now, I know, and I can speak for my own student who has dyslexia. If I do not pull away Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Cat Dog, and all those other graphic novels, he will not read. However, it's important that we still allow our students to have access to the things that they enjoy reading to help build those reading skills and still infusing some of the other things that they may not enjoy as much to give them exposure to different types of text. So reading comics, there's something called high-low books where it has high interest but low readability. So it's easier for the students to decode the text. Also graphic novels and poetry. And poetry is a great way to practice fluency skills. Also exposing your child to a variety of experiences to help build their background knowledge. And even if you can't physically expose them to some things, there are many resources available online that can help your student, help expose your student to different things that they may not have been exposed to previously. Also engaging your child in conversations about good reasons to read and write. And the last point is sharing stories about others who have overcome struggles with reading and even their own disabilities. So there are many YouTube videos about different people who grew up with dyslexia or other reading disabilities or just other disabilities in general. So tapping into that to help the student know that they're not alone. You are not by yourself. There are other people who have the same type of disabilities and who are successful today. So the latter part of my slides here, the presentation here, have all different types of resources that are available to you, and I'll go through them very quickly. There is a website called the Florida Center for Research, Reading Research, and they have a wealth of materials available. I've pulled out just a couple here. However, if you click on the first link where it says word study activities, this will take you to all different types of word study activities. Now notice that it's typically only for elementary school students. However, regardless of the student's age, these are some beneficial activities that you can make at home. That you can just print them out and laminate them if you want. You don't have to laminate them if you don't have that ability. However, there are so many activities here, and it's by reading area, vocabulary, comprehension. There's also fluency games in here. Lots and lots of resources available for you. Thank you, Dr. Gordon, for clicking on that. So again, these are just a few. However, if you go to that first link, you will be able to see all of them. Dr. Gordon, you can click on that next slide. I also have some information here about vocabulary lists for students in grades 1st through 12th grade. There's also a really helpful graphic organizer called the Frayer model for vocabulary. And when we look at this, there are different parts of this particular graphic organizer that can be completed. So let's say the student is working on a specific vocabulary word. They would define the word, jot down some facts or characteristics about the word, and these are all things that the student can Google. Then they can try to generate some examples on their own if they're aware of any examples, and then non-examples. If the non-examples are difficult, you can cross that out and have the student draw a picture that will help them remember that vocabulary word. So again, this is a really helpful tool to help the student learn more vocabulary terms and also attach a visual representation to them. For fluency, I have linked different fluency norms by grade level. Then I've also linked some short fluency phrases to help your students build their fluency skills. Under the comprehension area, I have lots and lots of graphic organizers. Dr. Gordon, can you click on visualizing structure words? So as I mentioned when I talked about comprehension, there's something called visualization. And so when we visualize, there are 12 key areas to help your students think about: what, size, color, number, shape, where, movement, the mood, as well as what could possibly be in the background, and then perspective. In addition to when and sound. So when you click on this particular resource, there are some examples on the side for you. And if you have any questions about visualizing and verbalizing, you can definitely shoot me an email. I will be happy to help you with that particular area. The other parts that I want to point out, there is a website called readworks.org, which is a great website for different comprehension activities. There's also a link to Saddleback Books, which is a resource for high-low books. And then we've also included the Dyslexia app there for you. If you have any students who are in specific interventions provided by Prince George's County Public Schools, there are a wealth of parent resources here. I did link resources for Lexia, which is our intervention that some of our students are using. It's a computer-based intervention for grades K through 5. There's also Achieve 3000, which is for middle school. Some of our middle schools are using that. Other middle schools and high schools are using Read 180 Systems 44. And if we have any parents who have students in CRI or regional programs, there are also resources there for a program called ULS. So again, we definitely thank you for your time. We hope that you've been able to benefit from all the information that we shared. We know it's a lot of information, but hopefully you found some useful resources for yourself and your children. After this presentation, how do you feel about supporting your child's reading needs? And if you want to unmute, since we have a very small group, you are welcome to do so. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. And if you don't want to unmute, you can always put your questions in the chat.
Takisha, someone said Pamela says, I feel excited and empowered.
Yay, that's
Wow, yes, that's
awesome.
awesome. Great, great. Wonderful, Pamela.
Learning